Hello, my name is Tom Morgan. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and today I'd like to talk to you about Microsoft Graph. So if you're a developer and you're developing applications on the Microsoft stack, maybe you've heard of Graph before, but you might not yet have had an occasion to use it or really understand what it is and why it's so important. So I want to get that over today. So it's a really, really important part of building Microsoft-based solutions today. And it's really easy to get started using Graph. So for me, Graph is the most important developer platform you can build on today. Why do I say that? Because Graph gives you access to data. Data is the most important asset when it comes to building solutions. Everywhere we look, people are demanding more access to their data. So it used to be you could get away with writing line of business applications and maybe they only surfaced half the information people needed to make a decision. They needed to go to a couple of different places, to a couple of different applications to get their answer. But that's really changing now because users are demanding their line of business applications work harder. They've seen what more and more sophisticated consumer apps are doing, and they're demanding that their line of business applications do the same. And if you've got users that are on the Microsoft 365 stack, they're using Office 365 workloads, then Microsoft is taking loads and loads of information about those users. So not just the files, the chats, the calls, the meetings, but things like the meta information, the devices they're using, the free and busy times, their managers, the people they work with. And here's the thing, Microsoft are taking all this information, but they want to give it back to you. They're not like mining it all for like the commercial gain of Microsoft. They would rather give it to you in a nice, easy to consume platform that means that you, the application developer, the enterprise developer, you can build line of business applications that take the data from users and make it, really pop, make it a real advantage to users. Microsoft is saying it's your data. Let's, give you a platform to consume it. That's what Graph is. It's a massive API. It's really a collection of a bunch of APIs that span all across the Microsoft 365 estate and give developers access to a massive range of information. One of the key benefits of Graph is even though it is lots of kind of separate APIs, they're actually all bundled together around a common namespace, a common authentication process, and a common set of permissions and documentation. What that means is you solve auth once, you've got one set of permissions for your admin to agree to, and then all the documentation is all in one place. It's very easy to see what permissions are needed to make what calls, and all the calls are happening in a common, structured, standard way, making it very, very easy to work with. You don't need to fully understand going into use of an API. You don't need to understand exactly how it all hangs together. If you know it's in Graph, you know roughly how it's going to look. You know the results are going to be in JSON. You know it's going to support OData. You can take a lot of these things for granted. So the best way to get started with Graph is Graph Explorer. And that's what we're looking at on the screen now. So Graph Explorer, you can go to it, developer.microsoft.com/graph Explorer. I'll put all the links to this in the descriptions because it's kind of easier. When you hit this page, you'll see a couple of things. So first of all, you've got requests and response at the top. Let's just start with a really easy one here. And I'm going to come back to this getting started section here, but I'm just going to click my profile here. And you can see it's set a URL here of graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/me. Okay, so we can see we're on the version 1 of the API, and we're going to do /me. If I run this query, it's run already, you can see the preview, the response under here. You can see this JSON file, and in this JSON file, you can see some information about me. Now, it's not actually about me. This is sample data. Okay, so one of the easy things to use in Graph is that you don't even need to fix authentication before you can start looking at Graph and seeing what's possible, because Microsoft will give you sample data. This is really, really useful for just understanding what type of information does this API call return. So you can use the sample data, and then when you're ready, you can switch over, you can sign in with your account, you can set up your permissions against your tenant, and you can start getting your own data. So I can see this sample data for my profile. I'm going to use these links down the left-hand side here to get different information. So my photo, as I do that, it's changing the URL here. I can also type into this URL myself if I know what I'm doing. So I might, for instance, start, so you can see on the screen here, I've got some getting started queries, but I've also got some Microsoft Teams ones. So I make it very easy to go and see what teams I'm a member of, my joined teams. Here you can see up at the top, /me/join teams. In this response data, there's 3 teams I'm a member of. Now I can take the ID of those teams. Because I know what the calls are, like I could go and look in the samples, but because I know what the calls are, I know I can go teams and then the ID, and I can run that query. So I can do it that way instead. I can type the calls I want to make. And this is really useful then for like digging into data, adding OData query filters, and so on. So now I can look at this team. Maybe I want to get the channels for the team, so I can look at channels. And then I might want to pick a particular channel, so I can again take the ID, and I'm just building up these queries, really discovering how this API works. And the idea of this is that it then makes it very easy to build into my application because I understand how the API works. So now I'm getting very specific information about one channel in my team. Now I talked about these samples on the left-hand side. There's a button here called Show More Samples. Now if I click that, look at all these different sample categories you can bring in. So if you know that the data you want to get is in a specific area, let's say Excel, I can turn that on, I can turn off the Teams one, and now if you look on the left-hand side, I've got these posts as well as gets. You know, Graph isn't just about getting data, it's about sending back data as well. I can do things like create sessions, add a worksheet, calculate a loan payment, all these different examples, these different samples available to me. So Graph Explorer is super, super powerful. Whilst you're here, have a look up here at the Getting Started. Pick your particular language because there are Getting Started guides for all these different languages. The API reference is definitely worth going to have a look at because if you look down the left-hand side here, all of those calls, you just find where you need them. So for instance, teamwork, teams, we were just looking at getting teams. Now I can see the call here. This is the call I made, get/teams and the ID. I can see exactly the permissions I need to make those happen. And I can see exactly what the response is going to be. So again, this is across all of Graph, all the documentation in one easy to use place. Now, when we were talking earlier and I was reading out the URL, I said v1.0, that's version 1 of the API. There is also a beta version of the API. So in the documentation, I can drop down this list here and I can choose beta, and that will reload the API definitions to include beta calls. I can do the same thing in Graph Explorer. If I come back to the Graph Explorer and let it load, here I can change this URL to be beta, okay? And then I'm making beta calls. Now beta, you shouldn't use those in production. They are subject to change. They will have different throttling rules. They will have different SLAs, so just bear that in mind. But if you can't find what you're looking for in the V1, maybe go and have a look at beta and see if it's there instead. So we talked about API referencing. Also worth looking at the documentation. Loads and loads of documentation across lots of different languages. Look at all these quick starts. Look at the tutorials and the SDKs for all these different languages, not just .NET. You know, this is very, very cross-platform because really all Microsoft Graph it's a collection of API endpoints. It's requests and response. It's not tied to a particular Microsoft technology. So that makes it very, very powerful. Finally, one more thing I want to show you. So if you've done any work with HTTP, then you may well have come across Postman, which is a really useful developer tool for building up HTTP requests and responses. So what the Graph team have done is created a Postman collection that makes it really easy to use Postman alongside Graph as well. So you don't have to do this. If you're happy using the Graph Explorer, that's great, carry on using the Graph Explorer. But if you're really familiar with Postman and you want to bring some of that in, then you can absolutely do that. So I'll link to the GitHub repository where you can add the Postman collection for Graph. I'm going to show you what it looks like on the screen. So you can see here, so down the left-hand side, this is my collection. Look at all these different calls I can make. So we were just looking at Teams, so I can make all these calls. They're already written out for me in Postman. All I need to do is kind of fill in any information I want. Now, one of the big things around this is authentication. What the team have done here, which I think is really, really smart, is let's have a look. So they've used environments. So up here in the top right-hand side where it says no environment, if I can change that to Microsoft Graph environment. That comes in when you add the collection, by the way. And then if I look at this I here for the environment quick look and edit, here I can add in the information, my client ID, my client secret, that for my application in Graph. Now, I'm not going to cover auth of Graph in Graph, but it's OAuth, so you can go and look it all up. You create an application, you get your client ID, you get client secret. You can add all that in here, and then when you do that, so this there's a cooldown here for get user access tokens. That's the first thing you do normally in auth, right? You go present your credentials and you'd get an access token, and that's what this does. But if you look, it's using that information from the environment. So if you put your tenant ID in the environment, this call will magically work for you. If you also have a look at the body, if you put the client ID in your environment and the username and password, all this stuff, if you put it in the environment, not only will this get access token work, but even more incredibly, when it completes, it will take the user access token, it will write it back as an environment variable. Still with me, right? Your access token, your bearer token, it will put it back into that environment, meaning that any subsequent calls you make which require it, here it is. Yeah, it's pointing back. So you aren't now copying and pasting these bearer tokens around, making sure they stay up to date. You can do it once. It will go into your environment variable, and then you can carry on using Graph in Postman. Super, super useful, very, very powerful. So I wanted to leave that with you, but that's a kind of take it or leave it. You don't need to do that if you don't want to. If you're happy using Graph Explorer, then please continue to use Graph Explorer. If you haven't done anything with Graph, you absolutely should go and have a look at the breadth of information you can get out of Graph, because it will enable you to build better applications. I hope that's been a useful kind of very quick overview around Graph and some of the tools you can use. I hope you find these kind of videos useful. If you do, you should know I do a ton more of them on my YouTube channel, so please go and subscribe to that. And you can also follow me on Twitter. All the information is on the screen. Thank you very much for watching.